Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Atlantic Council for the launch of our report, New Energy Strategy for the Western Hemisphere. It's this report. If you haven't grabbed one, they're outside, so please do grab one on your way out the door if you didn't get one on the way in. My name is Randy Bell. I'm the director of the Global Energy Center here at the Atlantic Council and the Richard Morningstar Chair for Global Energy Security. Richard Morningstar is sitting in the audience. Just to be clear, he is not dead. Rumors to the contrary. We are delighted to host the United States Undersecretary of Energy, Mark Menzies, as we launch this important report. This report is the final product of a project led by the Atlantic Council, our Global Energy Center, and our Adrian Arsh Latin America Center, but commissioned by the DOE as to conduct an independent analysis and outline recommendations in how DOE can help galvanize the development of natural resources, expand energy access, and deepen integration of energy markets in the Americas. So over the past 6 months, we've convened leaders from the public and private sector from 6 representative countries from the hemisphere: Argentina, Brazil, Canada, Colombia, Guyana, and Mexico, to inform our conversation about the U.S.'s engagement and collaboration throughout the region. These countries are not only close partners with the U.S., but represent different energy needs and were crucial to devising the roadmap that is outlined in this report. David Goldwyn, the author of the report and the chairman of the Atlantic Council's Energy Advisory Group, will go into the details of the report in a little bit. But a key takeaway, which was summarized by the Secretary of Energy, Dan Brouillette, a few weeks ago here at the Atlantic Council, is he noted the importance of promoting rules-based markets to catalyze energy development, and that investment is a pillar of energy security and demands, quote, a modern blueprint for supporting energy projects all across the Americas. So this strategy is rooted in the idea that the United States is a unique partner to support energy development with all interested parties in the region, leveraging U.S. technical capacity, sharing best practices and lessons learned, and supporting investment opportunities could enhance the region's access to affordable, reliable, and cleaner energy. So it was quite a pleasure to work so closely with DOE on this project, and I'd like to thank the Undersecretary's colleagues at the DOE, especially those from the Office of International Affairs: Ken Stevens, Sheila Moynihan, and Dane Banson. Always a pleasure to work with you all. And I'd also like to acknowledge those here in the audience who we worked with: Guinea's Ambassador Riyad Insanali, Deputy Chief of Mission from Colombia, Mariana Pacheco, and then the representatives from the other stakeholder countries for the project who are here with us today and watching online. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone this conversation is on the record and is being live streamed, so the Q&A towards the end, don't ask any questions that you, your parents, or children will be embarrassed about. We hope that you follow this conversation on Twitter using the hashtag WestHemEnergy, so West, H-E-M, Energy. For those of you who grabbed lunch, and if there's any trash, please recycle the trash in the appropriate bins as part of the Atlantic Council's new sustainability initiative. We're going to be announcing more about that in the coming weeks. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Undersecretary Mark Menzies for his opening remarks. You have his biography, but I think it's really worth highlighting that President Trump recently announced his intent to nominate Undersecretary Menzies as the Deputy Secretary of Energy. So, Mr. Undersecretary, welcome to the Atlantic Council. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Randy, for those comments and introduction. I noted on the introduction, the one key thing that I do ask people to remind the audience is that I am a double graduate of the national championships, LSU Fighting Tigers. I just wanted to make sure that everybody was aware that you will hear that throughout the entire year, just so that you know. But it's for an entire year. Thank you for having me, Ambassador Morningstar. It is always good to see you and to confirm, in fact, that you are here. I didn't know there was a question about it, but it's always good to see you. The Secretary sends his regrets and regards, but he always enjoys coming over to the Atlantic Council. I know that we all enjoyed looking at the report, reading the report that we're going to release here today, and I want to compliment the leaders of the Atlantic Council, Jason, and others, and I think we look forward to that serving as a foundation for for a lot of good work in the region. Jason, I'd like to thank you and your colleagues on the Atlantic Council for hosting all of us here today. And I'd especially like to thank you for the hard work that you've put into this very timely report. It's entitled A New Energy Strategy for the Western Hemisphere. Now today, we are heirs to a completely transformed energy landscape. The United States has gone from an energy-dependent country prone to shortages and subject to the whims of overseas autocrats to an energy-independent nation sharing its abundance throughout the world. Today, the United States is the world's #1 producer of both oil and natural gas, as well as the world's second largest generator of wind and solar power. We're also leading the world in reducing energy-related carbon emissions, declines which are expected to continue for at least the next 2 years. According to the International Energy Agency, U.S. energy-related CO2 emissions have declined by nearly 1 gigaton from the peak in 2000. It's described as the largest absolute decline by any country over that period. These developments strengthen our energy security, improve our economic security, and bolster our national security. And their benefits go far beyond our borders. Yet for these benefits to be fully appreciated, to ensure we have a more secure and prosperous Western Hemisphere and the world, we must encourage more free, transparent, and rules-based markets with nations, and more commerce and cooperation among them. That's why we're strengthening our partnerships with our hemispheric neighbors. It's why we're exporting LNG to 38 countries across 5 continents, including 11 countries right here in our own hemisphere. And it's why we're urging countries across our hemisphere and around the globe to embrace freedom, transparency, innovation, and to build a future of energy security and economic prosperity. As our closest neighbors and strongest trading partners, the energy and economic security of countries in the Western Hemisphere is critically linked to our own. The hemisphere is also indispensably tied to U.S. energy security. The U.S. derives the majority of our imports from oil, gas, and electricity from our neighbors, Canada and Mexico, and the region is also home to some of our largest importers of U.S. energy. Yet, there is still vast, untapped potential and ample and abundant opportunities for energy development, access, and integration across the region. From unconventional gas projects such as Vaca Muerta in Argentina and pre-salt drilling in Brazil, to renewables potential in Colombia and Chile, the Americas presents great opportunities to develop energy resources, achieve energy security, and foster economic growth. However, many nations in the hemisphere face serious challenges in competing for new investment in electricity, oil, and natural gas development, energy transportation, and energy services. This lack of infrastructure, investment impedes economic growth in the region, and governments in Latin America and the Caribbean recognize that this is a challenge that must be met. Galvanizing that investment won't be quick or easy, but it is essential, and the United States stands ready to assist. As part of our commitment to that effort, we launched an initiative called Growth in the Americas, are America Crece, which seeks to catalyze private sector infrastructure investment in Latin America and the Caribbean. U.S. companies can play an important role in bringing capital and expertise to produce oil and natural gas, generate power, and build energy infrastructure across the Americas. They benefit from close geographic proximity and shared cultural ties with our neighbors, and they can also provide the best, safest technology in the world with clear, transparent motives. Unlike other potential trading partners, the U.S. is committed to transparent, fair processes for energy investment, decisions that enhance energy and economic security, and allow each nation to determine its own destiny. We're convinced that if we want to live in a hemisphere filled with stable and prosperous nations, we should actively promote economic growth by encouraging the responsible development of all forms of energy. That's why we're so eager to share our innovation and technological prowess and spread our energy bounty. And the United States, led by the Department of Energy, is uniquely positioned to be a leader in joining partners from around the hemisphere together in an effort to dramatically enhance energy investment in the infrastructure. Working together, we can build the Western Hemisphere into an energy powerhouse that will boost our economies, strengthen our respective energy security, and serve as a counterweight to foreign adversaries. With this goal in mind, last year we launched an initiative with the Atlantic Council to develop a new strategy for engaging in Western Hemisphere partners on the energy issues. In support of this initiative, over the past few months, the Atlantic Council has had consultations with government officials, thought leaders from key countries throughout the region, including Argentina, Brazil, Canada, Guyana, Colombia, and Mexico, to ensure the report reflects on-the-ground realities and captures the latest developments in the dynamic energy sectors in these countries. The Atlantic Council is also engaged in private sector companies to identify U.S. core competencies and to ensure the recommendations contained in the report advance U.S. priorities while also bolstering the region as a whole. Through these engagements and independent in-house analysis, the Atlantic Council has developed concrete recommendations on how DOE can help strengthen the Western Hemisphere by supporting the development and expansion of energy projects across North America, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. The key findings from this effort have been captured in the report I mentioned before, being launched here today, a new energy strategy for the Western Hemisphere. We greatly appreciate the Atlantic Council's leading this important initiative, and we want to congratulate you on a successful completion of the report. The report will inform the Department of Energy's approach to energy engagements in the Western Hemisphere in 2020 and beyond. So thank you once more. We look forward to working with our friends and partners across the Western Hemisphere to build a future of energy security, prosperity, and opportunity. Thank you very much for having me here this morning.
Thank you so much, Mr. Undersecretary. It's been a real pleasure again to work with your team on this project. Now I'd like to welcome to the stage David Goldwyn, the chairman of the Atlantic Council's Energy Advisory Group and the author of this report, to give some of the highlights. And then after that, we will have a panel moderated by my colleague Jason Marksack.
Thanks, Randy. And if you can put the slides up, that'd be great as well. See if I can operate those. Terrific. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for being here. As you've heard today, this project was a true collaboration. We talked to the countries in the region one-on-one, and in groups we talked to companies to find out what were the obstacles to investment and what did we need to unblock in order to help countries grow. Because the real key to this is really about growth and opportunity for our neighbors in the hemisphere. And we started from the proposition that, I'll come back to that. We started from the proposition, which probably needed restating, which is that the prosperity of our neighbors is important to U.S. national interests. Promotion of democracy, promotion of liberal market economies, promotion of their security and prosperity is very much tied to our own. And while we understood that it's a very heterogeneous set of countries in the Southern Cone, in Central America, and in elsewhere, that we have a great deal in common and we can all benefit from partnership. To some extent already, Mexico and Canada are major trading partners. Brazil, Argentina, Guyana are enormous sources, destinations for U.S. investment. Colombia is a security partner as well as a trade partner. And we also agreed, although they weren't at the table, of the importance of promoting prosperity in Central America and regional integration there, and promoting resilience in the Caribbean. So the essence of the strategy is that the U.S. Department of Energy, which has deep technical expertise in its offices and in its national laboratories, can leverage the leadership and, frankly, the commitment of a Secretary of Energy to lead this effort. You really need a cabinet secretary to put their shoulder to the wheel on something like this in order to bring the agencies together, in order to bring other countries together. And by doing that, we can share knowledge and come up with solutions to these obstacles to investment. And I say share knowledge because this is not really just a top-down initiative. This is not about the United States delivering wisdom to everyone else. There's a lot that these countries can learn from each other. And as we'll go through the initiative, Argentina has been a pioneer in renewables, Mexico in energy efficiency. Canada and I would say in Brazil and others have had a great deal of experience in dealing with indigenous communities. So it's not all about the United States teaching others. It's about creating a table and a platform really where we can learn from each other. And so whether the countries sought increased investment in accelerating the energy transition, in building out renewable energy, in increasing oil and gas investment, in building pipelines or developing critical minerals, or even nuclear energy. My colleague Dan Poneman is here today. We heard a lot about that. They're all facing a pretty challenging investment environment. And so, the reality is there's no shortage of private and to some extent public capital available, but all of the action is in Asia. That's where all of the demand is. And it's a very competitive environment for capital. And a lot of the countries in the hemisphere have serious either macroeconomic or microeconomic challenges which prevent investment from flowing to their projects. So our goal was to focus on what are these challenges and how do we fix them. So the first slide you see up there is our core principles. And so the idea is the principles behind this is that it would welcome all democratic nations in the hemisphere that are interested in partnering with the department. So this will be, to some extent, a demand-driven initiative. Second, that we're going to utilize existing platforms to try and deliver this initiative. So we have the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas. We have a lot of initiatives. Been a bureaucrat long enough to know that inventing something new to layer on top of everything else that you have, not always the best idea, not always welcome. So we'll do those. Third, as we've discussed, to leverage the deep technical expertise of the Department of Energy. Fourth is to utilize a whole-of-government approach. And I think as you heard from Undersecretary Menzies and others, there are a lot of departments. USTDA works in the atmosphere. Commerce has the lead on America Cresse. The Department of State has an energy governance initiative that it works on, as well as a power sector initiative. Lots of departments are doing work. The idea is to use a whole-of-government approach to maximize all of us pulling together. And finally, to measure our success by whether we modernize some of these energy systems and whether we increase levels of financing and investment. The three structural elements are these. First is the leadership of the Secretary of Energy and the Secretary's commitment to try and push this and commit the department. The second is we've recommended the convening of an energy summit, at least every couple of years, because these are action-forcing events to try and pull people together and get energy ministries at the ministerial level to come here to have these conversations. And third is what we're calling a regional collaboration forum, and this is the bespoke aspect of the initiative. And the idea is to convene these multilateral or sometimes bilateral tables on issues together, and those don't have to be all at the same time in Washington. Those can be, in country. They can be in different parts of the hemisphere. But the idea is to focus on the issues that matter and have informed, guided conversations by people who are expert in these particular fields. So you can read the topics for yourself, but essentially the effort falls into four major baskets. The first is energy governance, which is about capacity building. And we heard this from virtually every country that we spoke to. They need help in terms of building capacity in the power sector, tariff setting, harmonizing regulatory frameworks in the unconventional sector. How do you have safe and efficient means of developing unconventionals? How do you target energy subsidies so that you're only helping the poor but not everybody? It's huge pricing distortion. The second category is modernization and advanced technologies. A lot of interest in advanced battery storage, a lot of interest in expanding energy access, and not just expanding electricity to rural populations, although that's part of it. But if you've got a mining operation in the northwest of the country and there's no electricity to get there, delivering electricity is about industrial development. So there's a lot of interest there as well. On supporting diverse fuels, we had a lot of interest in nuclear power and also building regional gas markets in the Southern Cone. There's a lot of gas in the Southern Cone and a lot of consumers. There's no real market. And finally, financing and private sector engagement. Everybody wants financing for their projects, and a lot of the issue there is how do you get it, and what is it that you need to get investors to invest. This table is hard to read. You'll see it in there. It's just describing what the 15 areas were where we talked to countries about their areas of interest, what they were. And I think my takeaway here is really the degree of commonality, which kind of surprised us, that from nuclear power to advanced electricity systems to battery storage, a lot of countries, whether they are oil and gas rich or whether they're deep into the energy transition, are interested in a lot of the same issues. And that really gave us the reinforcement and the belief that if the Department of Energy can bring people in the government together and bring experts from the state level and others, that we can really add some value. We can identify the challenges these countries face, and we can help them overcome the obstacles to investment. So for the rest of the details, you'll have to read the report. But we think this creates a structure and a format that the Department of Energy can work with. We think it's sustainable over a long period of time. We think it's bespoke enough that it will tailor itself to the issues that the countries are concerned with. And so I just want to close by saying just a few words of thanks. I want to thank all the countries who sat with us one-on-one and were very candid about the challenges they faced and the help that they would welcome. I want to thank our colleagues at the Department of Energy, Sheila and Kenny and Dane, for being such great partners, to all the companies who were very frank with us about their challenges, and then to the rest of our team, Andrea Clabo, my rock star associate who's with me on every project, and here Felipe Zarama Salazar and Reed Blakemore, who really made this whole thing run, and of course Randy and Jason. So it's been a great effort. It's great advice. We hope the Department of Energy will take it. We're very encouraged by what we heard from Undersecretary Menzies today. And with that, I think it's time to turn to our panel.
Well, thanks, David. As everyone's taking the stage, we'll remove the podium here. Again, I'm Jason Marzak, the director of the Adrian Arch Latin America Center. And again, as David said, I'll reinforce again, great to be releasing the strategy with the Department of Energy. As Undersecretary Menzies said, the goal really is to help to further convert the hemisphere into a real energy powerhouse. So we're gonna talk about that as part of this panel. We're gonna drill down on some of the findings and recommendations. I'll start off by introducing the speakers who represent, I think, three key organizations, institutions that are paramount to the strategy: Development Finance Corporation, American Development Bank, and Brian for the private sector through SEMPRA. I'm going to go left to right just quickly. Brian Cowley. Brian is the Vice President of Federal Government Affairs at SEMPRA. You joined last summer, which we just, I guess that's 10 minutes.
I'm about at 20 minutes
20
now.
minutes now. Okay, so he's been at SEMPRA for 20 minutes, otherwise known as since last summer. Brian brings extensive experience in public policy and government affairs. Beforehand, he was the president and founder of BK Strategies. Thanks for joining, Brian. That's great. Next to Brian is Christy Palakia. Christy is a senior advisor for the Western Hemisphere in the U.S. International Development Corporation. Christy has been with DFC since its beginning, and even before that. Christy was she was over at OPIC beforehand, coming to OPIC in May of last year. Previously, about 5 years working at Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation, also BNP Paribas. So great to have you, Christy. Always great to partner with you specifically and with DFC overall.
Likewise.
Next to Christy is Ariel Yepes. Ariel is the Energy Division Chief at the Inter-American Development Bank. 5 years, Ariel, at the IDB?
That's right.
5 years as the Energy Division Chief at the IDB. He was previously at the World Bank as a senior energy economist and also held a number of positions in Mexico's Ministry of Finance and also at Pemex. And of course, David Goldwyn, rounding out the panel, who I always say is also, if I could give a black belt and energy issues, I'd give it to David. So I don't have that black belt, David, but one day I might. Please feel free to continue tweeting using the hashtag WestHemEnergy, and we're going to drill down over the course of the panel on a number of the conversation that David raised at the beginning. David, I'll start off with you after following your presentation. The strategy, as you mentioned, proposes a regional platform for cooperation between the U.S. And its partners across the hemisphere. What do you see as some of the most, or what did we see as part of the consultations as some of the most promising areas for cooperation across the region?
Great, thanks, Jason. Well, certainly the most requested area of cooperation was power sector financing framework and investment. And I think because if you look at the region, Latin America is probably the closest to meeting its Paris targets of any region in the world. They've had tremendous progress, but integrating renewables into the system, building out the electricity system, distributed energy, relieving price distortions, it's all in that power sector mix. So that was the number one requested, followed by innovation and advanced energy technologies and advanced battery storage. And those really surprised me, but a lot of it is about distributed generation and about ways to how do you back up renewables and back up intermittency, and some of that's gas. So that was number one.
Why did that surprise you?
Well, it surprised me because I guess I didn't think of for countries that were big oil and gas producers or that had significant amounts of renewables. I didn't strike me that advanced battery storage would be sort of a top line issue, but it's all about making electricity systems sustainable. So I say that's the most requested. Industrial development and capacity building is probably the most necessary because it's about promoting growth. And then, and why us? I think just because between the federal and state systems, the U.S. has such exposure to such a diverse number of power systems and regional systems that somewhere in the U.S. mix, we've got a system that probably matches up pretty well to what a country's got.
Yeah. Christy, I want to go to you. Undersecretary Menzies mentioned America Crece in his opening remarks. You and also your CEO, Adam Bowler, have traveled quite extensively to the region over the last few months. Mexico, Colombia, El Salvador, probably just a few of the countries you've been visiting. I believe the DFC over $6 billion in active commitments across the hemisphere.
That's right.
Over $6 billion. Can you update on some of the DFC's priorities in the energy space, especially because we have representatives from not only the 6 countries as part of the report, but I think a number of other countries across the hemisphere?
Sure. And thank you for having me here today, and thank you for this excellent report. So I guess a couple of things. When the DFC overall, we have really 3 main priorities. The first is development, and energy across the entire hemisphere is a key driver of development. Returning money to the taxpayer, right? And so I think this report is actually critical in America Crece as well, because it's helping companies get to the point, or helping projects get to the point where they're financeable and they're ready to receive financing, and that's where we can really be helpful. And then the third is foreign policy priorities, and all the countries that you work with in the report are key partners of the United States. America Crece in particular has very similar objectives to what I think this report is proposing, and that is to help countries in the areas of infrastructure and energy establish the frameworks that are necessary to bring these projects to fruition. And so I think this report is actually very complementary to America Crece, and I'm very grateful that you put it together.
And what do you see in the strategy? What do you that we put forward? Some of the most key elements that are helping to advance DFC's priorities.
I think the key is really, and David touched upon this earlier when you were talking about sort of the best practices from all the countries. I think, when countries are looking at how to come up with their frameworks, America Cressy is a fantastic initiative, but it's driven by the U.S. Mm-hmm. It's driven by the U.S. So it might be perceived. I think one of the nice things about this report is that it looks across all the countries and allows countries to share in best practices in a very transparent way.
And it seems like as well, I mean, the report is very much, as David, you said in your overview, it's about the U.S. working together with partners across the hemisphere and helping to bring together partners, because there's a lot of lessons learned from countries all across the hemisphere on energy integration. And I think it's also similar with the new DFC model and actually financing companies and projects that are coming from countries outside of the United States.
Yeah, and I think the DFC is just one piece of the puzzle. We can offer financing, but between commerce, between USTDA, we can help projects between Treasury and OTA. I think they've done amazing work in specific countries to help identify frameworks that can then allow for projects to be financed.
Brian, I want to turn to you and bring on the private. You're representing the private sector's perspective. Big task through
it's very heavy.
Very heavy here with your role with Sempra. But what do you see as some of the biggest when you look across the hemisphere and look at opportunities for investment? What do you see as some of the biggest opportunities and challenges, and to what extent does that align with some of the findings of the report?
Well, thank you, Jason. And by the way, I got asked if I was wearing a vest because it was coronavirus protective. It's more utilitarian. It's just I don't like wearing a coat. But it's interesting that, and what the report talks about is it's kind of connecting dots. And with Sempra, we're a 40 million customer company headquartered in California with operations in Texas and in Mexico and Peru and Chile. And as we think about kind of some of the challenges, is how do you build energy infrastructure in an age where global financing is creating some interesting issues with regard to ESG. And when you talk about energy infrastructure from a fossil standpoint, what do the capital markets look like in 15 and 20 years? Because a lot of, like our LNG properties, those are 10 to 15 year project builds, and building pipelines, and even transmission lines sometimes become difficult in terms of getting permitting to build, not just in the U.S. but around the world, because there are a variety of stakeholders that have interest in land, air emissions, and all these things. So we have to think about what are the opportunities to lower emissions, raise GDP, and change the dynamic about energy poverty. So we think about those three things. Mm-hmm. And in that, what are those opportunities? But there are challenges in that, in finding stable regulatory environment, stable financing, but also finding willing partners. And sometimes some countries are not willing to bring in foreign companies. They much rather to be more intra-company, so countries. So we look at this as, with the Paris Climate Agreement having this thing about net zero by 2050, we really don't know what that means. And so as you look at energy mixes going forward, what's the technology available? What's the data that's driving that conversation? And then how do you build an energy mix, which the report I thought was great, kind of laying out some milestones of how to get there. So that is something that we look at as another challenge as well.
What about opportunities?
Well, look, I'll give you an example in Mexico. So with our company, Ianova in Mexico, we have opportunities not only in natural gas, but in renewables, but also in energy storage, whether they be in liquid storage or gas storage, and pipelines. So we look at building out infrastructure, not just for now, but for 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years out from now. And look, I think you talked about interconnection. That is a huge opportunity, not just across border with Mexico, but in the Latin America region, but also down in the Southern Cone. That is a huge opportunity to bring forward.
I want to get back, Brian, to your point on ESG. I ask you a follow-up question on that, but I want to bring Ariel in first. Ariel, one of the key challenges that we identified in the report is obtaining a social license. You continue to do a lot of work at the IDB, and which is increasingly harder for companies across the hemisphere. it's critical, right? Ensuring that there are not social risks, but at the same time, you want to also avoid the bottlenecks that could be presented in obtaining that license. What have you seen insofar as listening to stakeholders across the hemisphere about some of the concerns that have been presented to that you've heard presented to you at the IDB? And also, how have you what have been some of your recommendations to adjust projects to be more in line with social licenses and social demands?
Thank you, Jason. And well, first of all, congratulations for the report. Is, I think, from our perspective at the Inter-American Development Bank, fully consistent with what we are promoting in the region and the kind of initiatives that we are bringing to our strategic clients in Latin America and the Caribbean. Definitely what we have seen in Latin America and the Caribbean is that the dialogue with the stakeholders is so critical. Mm-hmm. If you want to implement a project, either a pipeline, a transmission line, hydrogen generation facility, it is critical, it's really important to have a dialogue with the stakeholders, with the social communities. And the earlier you can have that dialogue, the better. It is not only because they can stop your project and it's going to be very expensive in terms of time, in terms of cost, but it is also critical in the sense that whenever you engage in a project, it's relevant to make sure that the value that you can bring to the community, to the country, to the place where you will implement that facility or that infrastructure is going to be fully consistent with the social and environmental concerns that the communities and the governments may have. So dialogue is critical, dialogue is fundamental. What we have realized in the whole region, it is not only for Central America, the Caribbean, or South America, but for the whole region, people is getting much more aware about how the projects that in the energy sector that they can see in the neighborhoods have to be fully consistent with not affecting the interest of the communities. And what we do at the bank is we can, whenever we start a project, the identification of a project, what we try to do is the sooner the better. We can try to engage in a dialogue, very open dialogue with the communities where the project is going to be, from the identification of the project, once that it's approved, during the implementation, and at the conclusion. And all the time, dialogue is fundamental and critical.
Yeah, and I, as you allude to, I mean, this is probably a positive thing that communities are more engaged, and then the question becomes how do you channel that engagement in a way that doesn't present bottlenecks for the development of viable projects. I mean, this is a key thing that you've been looking at the IDB.
Definitely, that's what we do, and it is all the time, trying to find the positive values that you will have in the implementation of a specific project and how that specific project will affect the community or the different interests of the people who is going to be in the neighborhoods of the project. If you are able enough to know what is going to affect and the way this project is going to affect the communities in that area, the earlier you will know how you can fix and how you can address those issues. Yeah. But as I said, dialogue is critical. Identifying the cost and benefits of having the projects in there and how you can address them from the very beginning is fundamental if you really want to be able to implement a positive project in the.
That's great. Thank you, Ariel. And I want to actually cue that up with you, Brian, as well. You were mentioning ESG. For all that we're in Washington, we like to use acronyms: ESG, environmental, social, and governance risks. And we were talking before about stakeholders with regard to global financing and the direction of banks of also taking into account ESG risks and their financing decisions. Can you explain for the audience what you're seeing insofar as that direction in banks and what the results of that could be?
Right, and thank you for that. So as we look at globally, and right now it's not necessarily anecdotal, but I'll give you two kind of examples that we have seen that you start connecting dots. So I don't know how many of you have flown into Heathrow Airport in the last, maybe not last week, but in the last couple of months. They're in the process of building a new runway. Well, that runway was just shut down by the courts in the UK because they could not define how it would meet the Paris Climate Agreement, right? So there's one. Two, you're starting to see some European banks saying that they will not invest into fossil energy infrastructure because they don't meet their requirements, whether it be pipelines or LNG facilities. So what we don't know, it's the Donald Rumsfeld, the known unknowns, or the unknown unknowns, where the capital markets are going to go with regard to investments into energy infrastructure. And I use energy infrastructure as a broad topic, not just fossil, but others. As part of that, if you're doing large capital spends, LNG projects, deep water drilling, even building out electricity grids that are tied to fossils, even part of renewables, what does it take if you can't get capital financing? Look, money is out there, but if certain banks refuse to loan, where does that money end up going? Is it the Chinese? Sovereign wealth funds? You just don't know. And that's a concern because, again, these projects are multi-year out and they're not small. I will say the other thing that's interesting to us is that, globally, as countries begin to look at their commitments about the environment, is as they're deciding what that mix is, how then do they think about the process of 2020, 2030, 2040, 2050 from an investment standpoint and then a technology and database standpoint. If you're going to make decisions on financing, what are you using as your benchmarks? There's no data.
Yeah.
And that to me is critical, is helping to try to define that box in the finance and the banking sector.
And I think that goes back to also, the comments Ariel made about stakeholder management, stakeholder engagement, right? And how do we find that nexus of best practices insofar as ensuring stakeholder engagement from the beginning? And David, something that we touched on in the report that you offered significantly, the importance of consultations to look at best practices in stakeholder management.
Right. I just wanted to come in on the ESG point because I think Brian makes an important point. It's, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to gas. Latin America is pretty interesting. The reason there is such LNG demand in Latin America largely is back up for hydro and renewables. You have great seasonal variation, you have weather variation, so it's about stabilizing the system. So you certainly you don't want to penalize that. So far, ESG, from the BlackRocks and others, if you read the fine print, it's about not investing in companies unless they are good about cleaning up their own act with respect to their own emissions. But I think looking forward, we do have to be careful about that. And for countries like Brazil, which have a lot of gas and want to build out a gas pipeline network so they can promote industrial development in other parts of the country, if they're meeting their target, and a lot of these countries are doing it, then you don't want to penalize a country for its development strategy, if they're on target. So there are lots of ways to approach this which are short of an absolute ban on investing in infrastructure per se. I think that's a...
Well, David, as you're talking about gas, and as we move thinking a little bit further about energy integration, one of the things you talk about in the report is integration of energy markets across the region, and specifically the development of unconventionals. Unconventionals in Southern Cone. I see our Argentine colleagues here. A lot of discussion in the report about Vaca Muerta and the opportunities that Vaca Muerta presents. But also you talk about our consultations, which show the potential of also the Department of Energy gathering regulators, prospective producers to share best practices around technology, stakeholder management, regulatory practices. So if you could talk a little bit about what impact the report's recommendations, and also not only the recommendations, but also what we'd like to do here at the Atlantic Council is turn ideas into action. So not only have the ideas, but how could we actually implement some of these ideas? What could be the impact of these recommendations on building regional gas markets in the Southern Cone specifically?
Well, I think first we can start the conversation about having a regional gas market in the Southern Cone. We've hosted actually a number of the regional regulators here at the Atlantic Council, and there's a lot of gas and there's a lot of demand, but the infrastructure doesn't necessarily connect well. So they haven't had a conversation about how you trade, about how you optimize storage, about how you harmonize regulations to trade gas. But Brazil wants gas from Argentina not because Brazil doesn't have a lot of gas, but it doesn't have it where it needs it. Mm-hmm. And so the opportunities for trade there to unlock Bolivia, even Argentina is looking at LNG importing at the same time they have Vaca Muerta. Why? Because there are parts of the country where they need access to gas, where the pipeline infrastructure doesn't exist. So I think we can both share a lot about how you get investment in that sector. open access pipelines, cost recoverable tariffs, predictability and security, but we can also talk about how you incentivize trade across borders. So I think there's a lot of enthusiasm, but we should get our regional transmission organizations, we should get FERC into the conversation. It's not all, not necessarily all about DOE, but companies that are in that business to show them how that can be applied regionally. I think there's great appetite, and what this strategy can do essentially is set the table for the conversation.
And Christy, David's I think has queued up a great question for you. It goes to DFC's priorities, which is about development of critical related infrastructure to actually be able to get, whether it's gas or other types of energy across markets, be able to connect markets with production centers. What are some of the opportunities that you see from a DFC perspective in the hemisphere insofar as advancing infrastructure development that's critical for connecting these markets?
I think when we look across the different countries, I think Brazil. You mentioned Brazil. I think the U.S. as an energy provider certainly has a lot of expertise in things like pipelines, right? I mean, that's one where we can be helpful in terms of financing U.S. providers that might be willing to go into Brazil and provide that expertise. As a DFC, we can provide access to things like, in Brazil, financing solar, right? I mean, I think that's critical in certain parts of the country. Distributed power is also critical. In Brazil, I think, in the oil and gas sector, there are some privatizations that are coming online. I think that's an area where we can really be helpful. In Argentina, clearly Vaca Muerta, is one that we've been active in. That's a sector that just makes a lot of sense for us, even as in terms of American and as the DFC, we're no longer limited to only working with U.S. companies, but it's one that certainly makes sense where we could help U.S. companies bring that expertise to Argentina. In Colombia, I mean, there's so many. Colombia has so many infrastructure needs, energy and outside of energy. But with respect to energy, I think. Or parallel industries, I think road infrastructure that can help to transport some of the energy, as well as solar and wind that have, some of the renewable auctions that have recently happened, as well as some of the LNG. And then in Guyana, there's a huge opportunity for E&P. And I think that's another area where we can be helpful, but we can also be helpful in all of the infrastructure needs that are going to be required in order to take Guyana to the next level.
I see Ambassador Ensenala here smiling, and the second row, as you mentioned, Guyana. Can
I comment on that?
Please.
I think something that David and Christy said it's very interesting. Is just like in the United States, Massachusetts is not Texas, and Texas is not Massachusetts. It's very hard to try to put everybody in the same box. Yes. Each country progresses at a different level. Yep. They have different energy needs and different. And if we sit here and say everybody is the same, that's not correct.
100%.
And so how we define how people progress and help them, I think, is very important and critical to whatever their mix is.
Yeah.
Look, NIMBY is not an Americanism. It is a globalism, not in my backyard. And it is, to Ariel's point about stakeholders. If stakeholders don't come along, it's very hard to shoehorn infrastructure in. Look, think about what's happening in the Northeast. You have a transmission line that's going to run from Quebec through Maine into Massachusetts. The people in Maine do not want that transmission line to cross their state. It's green energy, but they can't get it built because they can't get a permit. And so, again, it's stakeholders and how that process gets brought along to raise energy, lower energy poverty and raise GDP. That should be the goal. But you got to have everybody bought in, otherwise you end up with the NIMBY idea.
Yeah.
That's it.
Go ahead,
No,
Christy.
that's a great point, and you just made me think of Mexico, which is the one country that I didn't mention when I was talking about that. Mexico is a country where the DFC were currently active in the energy space. We weren't needed there a few years ago, right? In terms of stakeholders being bought in and participating in establishing a framework that works to attract private sector investment so that we can have, the country can have greater economic stability and growth is critical. And I just wanted to mention that because I think, Mexico is a place where we should not be needed as the DFC.
Ariel, I want to ask you a question about what you see as well, and then I'm going to do a quick informal poll of the audience, so just get ready. But Ariel, what do you see as some of the, when we're talking extensively about the region, but what do you see as some of the biggest opportunities to deepen integration in energy markets from the IDB perspective? What are you looking at most acutely?
In fact, the IDB is promoting different initiatives for regional integration in electricity in particular. And that started, more than 20 years ago with the integration of Central American the electricity market with CEPAC. And now it's a very successful project. In fact, in the last 5 years, the trade of electricity between the countries in Central America has increased by 6 times, almost 100% per year. So this is something that talks very positively about integration. That is Central America. The other ones that we are promoting are regional integration in electricity in the Andean countries. There's an initiative that we call CINEA. And there's another one for the South Cone, for Uruguay, Paraguay, Argentina, Chile, and Brazil. That is having some inertia, and the governments are very interested in promoting that initiative. The Caribbean as well for natural gas, not for electricity, for liquefied natural gas. But what we see for the whole region is that regional integration is important. It's positive in the sense that it is a win-win both for exporters and importing countries. But what is most important there, in many cases, more than having the infrastructure, is to have the right regulations.
Yeah.
If you don't have the regulations, if you don't have the institutional framework to enable, first of all, private sector participation and to have sound electricity or energy markets in general, it's going to be quite difficult to promote integration, even though everybody knows that integration is positive for the final consumer.
Ariel, you bring up a great point. I'm going to ask you, Brian, for a little bit later, specifically about regulations and regulatory stability. But as we've been talking, I just want to get quick, as we think about the Western Hemisphere, and think about whether there's more challenges or opportunities that are presented for energy integration. Just want to get a quick poll of those in the audience. More opportunities across the hemisphere? Raise your hand. Okay, so looks like about half. And who is more pessimistic than the fact that there's more challenges that are presented in regard to furthering integration? Okay, a few people, right? So we have a few people still to convince about the opportunities that could be created. We got
you in the back later.
We got a few more minutes to do that. Christy, I want to go back to you. You were mentioning Colombia before. I think you mentioned Brazil as well. I want to ask you specifically about what have you seen insofar as DFC has been rolling out across the hemisphere. What have you seen some of the lessons learned about improving investment frameworks that could really help to attract and secure finance? I mean, this is the big question. And Brian, you're leading this as well. How do you actually get the financing in? So what kind of steps can countries take from an investment framework perspective to really lure in that additional external investment?
It's such a good question, and I think it really just comes down to certainty. Right? To understanding that investors need certainty in order to move forward with financing. And I think that's why this report is so critical, and the idea of sharing best practices. I think that's what's so great about America Crece, right? Using the tools that we have to help countries come up with frameworks that work. And when you look at, Colombia is a great example of that. 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, foreign direct investment in Colombia was nowhere near what it is today. And what they did is they spent time, they learned from other countries like Peru to establish a PPP framework to put the road infrastructure into place, and they brought private sector investment. And that spills over to other sectors because investors, they get more comfortable with a country, and then they look at other sectors. I think Mexico is the counterpoint to that, right? They had regulatory frameworks. They had the energy reform a few years ago. Investors were really excited about Mexico, and now you see investors pulling back. After the Mexican government canceled threatened to cancel the Mexico City airport. The bonds widened. I was in the private sector at the time trying to finance sectors completely unrelated to infrastructure, and the cost of financing went up, almost prohibitively.
Right,
so I think it really comes down to certainty and frameworks. Even Argentina, when they put their road framework into place last year around the integrity framework, right? They had a scandal. They were the notebook scandal, similar to Lava Jato. They worked with 10 institutions to get them on board with establishing a framework that investors could get comfortable with. I think it's just about identifying the risks and having certainty around how you deal with them. It's so critical and so basic.
Yeah. Colombia, our plug for our U.S. Colombia task force that recommends, among other things, looks at actually the many strides that Colombia has made on improving the regulatory environment and the importance of continuing to move in that direction, the partnership, frankly, with the United States. Brian, from the private sector perspective, what are you looking at? Regulatory stability is critical, as is certainty. What kind of points? What are the touch points you're looking for? What kind of signals are you looking for from countries to be able to galvanize that, for Sempra to make a decision to actually invest?
Well, that's a great question, because Ariel and Christy touched on, and it's the same thing, whether it's regulatory certainty or finance certainty. It's the same thing. And again, when you're building projects that are decades and multi-decades long, again, I keep going back to LNG. It will take us 5 to 7 years just to build an LNG facility. Yeah. And if the rules change and you're moving the goalpost, you're not going to spend $10 billion on something that you don't know is going to be there. And to your point, Christy, about Mexico, for those that don't remember, during the whole USMCA issue, my friend Kenny and I think we're talking every day at DOE regarding Mexico about them wanting to change the rules on the pipelines and saying we want to renegotiate. For Sempra, that cost us $1 million a day for 6 months. And working with the AMLO administration and with our government, we got to an agreement. But that uncertainty not only was extremely costly, but it creates do you even want to go back down there?
Right.
Look, we have a great relationship with Mexico. But when you create uncertainty on that side, it gives you pause.
And even for a DFI, it's challenging for us. One of our goals is to mobilize private sector capital. We don't want to finance everything ourselves. We want to help bring the private sector along. And if the private sector has these concerns, then we can't even be helpful in a country like Mexico.
Yeah, David, I want to turn to the Caribbean, which we haven't talked about. You've written actually with the Atlantic Council. We've done some work on Caribbean energy needs. What do you see? The report focused on 6 countries across the hemisphere, but looked at the hemisphere from a general perspective overall. I'd love to ask you what you see the most pressing needs of the Caribbean, but then also we did spend some time talking extensively about Guyana as well. And so the report notes the particular need to establish energy governance and the short period in which Guyana has to really put together the structures behind its huge opportunities in the oil sector. So what do you see as the most pressing needs in the Caribbean right now? And then if you could talk a little bit about Guyana specifically.
Good. And I would just say first, we've heard from Brian and Christy, from Ariel and others, this common theme is framework and governance. And that's why a government-led initiative, talking to other governments, is so important, is they'll hear it from the companies and they'll see whether the investment comes or not, but sometimes that message goes down better when it comes from another government. In the Caribbean, there's been a tremendous amount of progress, but the Caribbean still is highly dependent on fossil fuels, pays higher electricity tariffs than certainly we do in the United States or most of their neighbors, and there is no regional one-size-fits-all initiative. You've got the Eastern Caribbean, the Western Caribbean. There are some countries that are that are great hubs like Jamaica and Dominican Republic for gas, and they can bring gas to back up renewables. And other places, there are places they can't reach. There's potential for solar, but in a lot of small islands, not necessarily wind. So the fix here is to have a bespoke initiative, and I think the IDB has done fantastic work and really leads all the multilateral development banks in the Caribbean. But it's to try and fix really technical problems, like how do you have a power purchase agreement? How do you introduce net metering? How do you get the state-dominated enterprise out of the business so the investor has an opportunity? How do you have even a strategy for an island that signals that for the next 10 or 15 years, we're going solar, we're going wind, or we're going gas backing up something else? And so the U.S. has helped, I think, a lot of Caribbean nations before, and there's been a lot of work. This really has to be demand-driven. The countries that want to help can. But almost all the work is really electricity and technical, and that's where I think the initiative can help and where the U.S. can help. On Guyana, there's so much going on in Guyana now, but the next stages are going to be both on fiscal governance. How do you manage the money when it comes in, that ramp up from $300 million to $4 billion, which is coming over the next 4 years. But also, how do you manage
unbelievable that quick
an unbelievable ramp up. But also, and we'll see, they'll, as they get through the elections, but the questions of how do you design an electricity system? How do you build out a transmission system? Are you going to move gas from the shore inward, or are you going to move electricity? These are all system design questions, and I think it'd be great for DOE to bring together, regional transmission organizations in some of the markets which are about that size, along with country experts to talk about how do you design the system, because it's a thin bench. And an enormous, any Guyanese government's going to have so much to do, even just managing their consultants, they're going to have a lot to do. But I think that's an area where we can really tailor something specific to their 1 or 2 year challenges and try and be helpful, just in the space they need it.
I'm gonna open up to questions in about 5 minutes. So start thinking about the most difficult questions possible for this expert panel. I want to go back, Ariel, to transit to as we look to the future about transition fuels as well. You've done we look in the report about at natural gas and the role of natural gas. I'd like to ask you specifically, Ariel, about what you're seeing from the IDB perspective on the potential for natural gas as a transition fuel, which is especially important for Vaca Muerta, and what kind of opportunities that could present.
Thank you, Jason. In fact, we delivered a project. This was a report last year on the perspectives for the electricity market in Latin America in the years to come, and that is for the coming 20 years. And the result of this analysis is that, renewable energy will continue being important, but thermal generation will continue there, but more than anything, switching from oil to natural gas. The potential for natural gas generation in Latin America is huge. It's among us. And when you talk about Vaca Muerta, when you talk about the Caribbean and Central America with the imports from the US, with LNG facilities, the possibilities that you have in the whole region to diversify the energy matrix and to switch from liquid fossil fuels to natural gas are critical. And I think that the composition of the generation matrix in the years to come in Latin America will have an important role for natural gas. That is a fact. There's no doubt about that. Where the gas is going to come from, in the south, we think there's a lot of potential with Vaca Muerta for Brazil, from Uruguay, Paraguay, and of course Argentina and Chile, even in Chile. But for Central America and the Caribbean, Mexico, as it is happening now, we think that most of the supply has necessarily to come from the US. And even what we see is some potential in the analysis that we did to export natural gas to South America as well, depending on the prices that they get in Vaca Muerta or in Presal in Brazil. So it is clear, we see something that is going to happen for sure. Natural gas will have an important role. Where the supply is going to come from, that's something that we have to see, and that will depend a lot on where do you develop the right, not only incentives, but the right regulations and institutions to promote the private sector participation to enable the exploration and production of natural gas in the south of the continent.
Brian, I want to, as Ariel's mentioned, looking at the future of energy, it would be important to talk about renewables. And Semper in particular is already meaningfully investing in renewable energy across the hemisphere. What do you see as the opportunities for private investment in renewables as you look across the Americas, and if you even feel free to drill down a couple countries in particular on which you're looking at?
Well, I think it's very important, and David and Ariel mentioned this. You have to have a broad energy mix. It is not one fuel, and it's all of the above and all of the below. And as we think about how, as countries are going to meet their climate agreements and these other things, what is that right mix? And to your point about renewables, because the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine, you have to have some form of a base load, and that is more than likely going to be gas. And as you build out this infrastructure, countries like Mexico, look, even Argentina, everybody's going to be looking at renewables as an option. I will say one of the things, just to add to that, this is not a hemispheric issue, this is a global issue. China, Saudi Arabia, everybody, Germany, are going to have to relook at how they design their energy grid. They're going to have to. How they design their energy infrastructure. And I cannot go back to this point that was brought up. If there is no stability of regulations and no stability of financing, it doesn't matter what you do. If you don't have that, you're not going to build. Period.
So Brian, actually, David, as well as we're looking, last question before I open up to everyone here, but we've talked extensively over the course of the last 40 minutes about many of the different opportunities and across different areas of energy investment across the hemisphere, the challenges and whatnot. David, one of the things that I think a key recommendation for DOE leadership as part of this strategy is a biannual energy summit that would focus on enhancing regional investments, trade, integration opportunities in the energy sector. Ariel mentions the potential collaboration with the Inter-American Development Bank. Christy, the report mentions the Development Finance Corporation throughout it as well. It's not just serendipitous that you're all on the panel. So, David, can you explain further? You talked about a little bit in your presentation, but also what do you see as the opportunity for DOE leadership through a summit like this, and how does this also fill a policy void or gap that currently exists?
Sure. Thanks, Jason. Well, first, everybody loves it. Everybody loves a good party. So if the Secretary of Energy calls a ministerial, brings all the ministers of the regions here, that provides a platform where the U.S. private sector, and we recommend a public-private component to the summit as well, where companies have the ability to talk to the people in charge of devising these frameworks face to face. It's a chance for these ministers to hear from their peers about the issues that are of concern, and for the U.S. to help set the agenda, but the agenda that the countries are interested in. And there's nothing like a summit to force essentially different parts of the U.S. government to work together on one initiative. So I think it's it's important to do it. The U.S. has done a lot in the past. It's been a little while. So I think it's really critical, and it will be one of the places where we can focus on those key issues. But in this big, great power rivalry that's going on around the world, people talk about can the U.S. compete with China when it comes to capital? And so we're not going to have a state budget, a DFC budget. But what the U.S. does do, and what DOE can help with, is we can leverage more private capital than other countries have state capital. And the way you do that, and that is all here, and it is multiples of the amount of state capital that's available for investment. And the key here is to unlock that private capital for these countries by letting capital talk to the countries about why it's not there and what needs to change. And DOE governments are the facilitator, the guider of that conversation in a way that is not threatening, that is helpful, and that's practical. And I think the summit is one way to do that at the macro level. But this regional cooperation forum is breaking down those issues one by one and doing it at the micro level as well.
If I could just add a point to that.
Please.
Because I think it's not about competing with China. It's about providing the capital that empowers the regions to have control over their own industries by bringing in private sector investment.
And also a question for you, Christy, and Ariel. The extent you don't have to agree with the ideas, but I'd love to get your thoughts on this idea of a biannual energy forum and also the regional cooperation forum. Ariel, please.
Yeah, I can elaborate about that. We have seen that in the past for the region. In some places, I mean, for Central America and for the Caribbean, it was organized 3 years ago by the Department of Energy and the Department of State, a summit to talk about what were the important energy issues in these regions to try to bring more private sector participation. And it was both. We have a table to talk about policy issues with government representatives and another one with private sector representatives. I think it was very successful. It was a very good exercise, but escalating that at a regional level definitely is going to be very positive. And it's going to be positive in the sense that I think that the Department of Energy has not only the network, but also the knowledge to promote and to bring to the table best practices. And what we have seen in the region is that countries are looking for that. Some cases, those best practices are in the US. Some other cases are in the region, in South, Central, and and in Mexico as well. So what I think it is that it is a very good initiative. Definitely the IDB will be happy to support that effort with the Department of Energy. But bringing private sector and policymakers is fantastic. It's something that is going to make a lot of inertia.
Fantastic, thank you.
Oh, I was just going to add what I love about it is it's transparent. I mean, America Cresse is great. The U.S. government, the U.S. clearly has the expertise in energy. What's nice about the biannual summit is that it allows transparency and visibility into what worked and what didn't work for the other countries. So I just think it's excellent.
Can I just give a yellow light on that, though? It's crawl, walk, run. We have to let countries evolve on their own time frame. And you give them a framework, but they have to absorb it themselves. If you try to jam it down somebody's throat, no company wants to go down there when it's been forced, right? And so how do we do that in the right way? And I think it's not just U.S. leadership, it's regional leadership, and people grow at their own pace.
I think that's the idea behind it, regional leadership, but somebody has to actually throw the party so all the party goers can come.
You can throw it, Dave.
Dave
Yep.
throws a good party. Can I open up to questions here? And microphones will be circulating. I see. First, we'll take 2 questions here on the first 2 rows. And if you could just say your name and affiliation and your question. We'll take this question here as well at the same time.
Is this on? Yeah, Emily Hirsch, DCDB Group. I just wanted to ask the panel to comment on whether or not they see a rise of like populism and nationalism as having any kinds of impacts on having a more regional strategy to these challenges. And then more specifically, if there's any thoughts on what's going to happen in Chile with the new constitutional reform, and if it has anything, any lessons that we can learn about potential effects of more nationalistic or more populist governments.
Emily, if you could just pass the microphone to Dick, and then we'll take your question in the second row.
Hi. Martin Loken, Embassy of Canada. So a question for David. I mean, as you look north, the starting point is a relationship that's already very, very large and sophisticated in terms of two-way energy trade and investment, and it contributes to our mutual security and prosperity in a big way. But in terms of future things that we can do, there's infrastructure for sure. But I think I saw on your table earlier that critical minerals and nuclear, perhaps advanced nuclear technologies, SMRs, and so on, are part of the mix. Interested in any thoughts you have on what we can do together in those areas.
Sure. Great, thanks, Martin. Well, Dick will take your question too.
Dick Morningstar, still alive. If following up a little bit on Emily, could you talk a little more about political risk? We lived through the situation in Argentina, 7 or 8 years ago when they nationalized, and there are problems there now. Other countries, how much should companies be concerned about political risk in looking at these opportunities?
Great, thanks. Let's address all those. Maybe, David, you had a specific question, so why don't we start with your specific question for Martin?
Well, let's start with Canada first, because I think that's the easiest. I think there's lots of areas of cooperation. The idea of cooperating on advanced nuclear really came from our conversations with Canada, but Brazil is interested in that conversation. Mexico is interested in that conversation, and so is the U.S. We have the new bilateral agreement on critical minerals, but Brazil is interested in critical minerals and others too. Everything from best practices in mining to social license to operate to how do you share value with the communities. And we still have a lot to talk about on cross-border electricity. I think the Northeast has been alluded to, but as we look at a clean energy future, bringing Canadian hydro into the country is something that's not an easy conversation, but something that will continue. So I think and social license to operate, where Canada has a lot of learning there. That's another area where we don't expect to lead that conversation. That's a conversation that that the U.S. wants to host, but where Canada has a lot to bring. So I think all of the above, we've got things to work together on. On populism and political risk, and I would say it's certainly made the conversation more complicated in some places and easier in others. At the political level, it's one thing. At the energy level, Brazil has a new populist government, but it's one that is focused on privatization, particularly of the gas network and other areas. So there's opportunities for cooperation there. Mexico has a new populist government that's taking a fresh look at the energy reform, but we can have a constructive conversation about how the Mexican president can put his own stamp on energy reform without throwing out the energy reform. And that's a conversation maybe that can be better had from peers than from the United States, but it's a conversation that needs to be had. And so, so I think it's a very heterogeneous response. And on political risk, I think both political risk and I would say credit risk in the Caribbean, but political risk in other countries, there's going to be increased demand for political risk insurance. I think for a lot of these projects in areas, where things are uncertain, the conversation for the U.S. government to host with the Department of Energy is, as countries see the price of that political risk in dollars and cents, to talk about things they can do to lower the cost of that risk. And that's the appropriate conversation for the governments to have, and the financial markets can speak for themselves.
Yeah, I'm going to jump on the political risk, but I'll leave it to the panel first. Ariel, Christy, or Brian, if you want to jump into either of those political risk questions.
Well, I think two things. On the political risk side, and you touched on this, it could be very different, right? And I think it comes back to the point that we've been really touching on about transparency and certainty. If the political risk is, if the government is taking a view that they want to, regardless of other political risks, if they want to create certainty in the contracts that they're establishing that serve as the backbone for financing, then not so much of an issue. There are other areas where the financial markets can be very helpful in mitigating political risk. I mean, even just to use an example, privatizations in Brazil, right? Some of the privatizations are happening at the municipal level or state level. Private investors like the risk, right? They might not be comfortable going 25 years in a certain country, but DFC or other providers could easily mitigate that risk and help to grow those markets. So I think it really depends.
So can I just answer what's interesting? That's a great question, because that's what I do is political risk. Is we're thinking about is a couple of things. So one of our biggest partners is TransCanada, and that's through pipelines and some other integrations that we have. And industry to industry partnerships in home countries is very important. A lot of times, so for Sempra, I may not be a known actor if I'm going into Brazil, but having a local partner, but also you want to show that you're a good actor. And part of having political risk, to your point, if you know that the contracts and the rule of law are stable, it doesn't necessarily matter what happens at the top if you know that stability will be there. And that is a huge thing. We're going to have a potential changeover here in November. There's political risk in that, in the energy business. But if contracts are stable and there may be changes in the regulatory structure, you're going to be okay. It's the wide swings that you're concerned about. And I think that is a 100% great question.
And looking across the hemisphere, I mean, there's different, obviously, ideological governments. I think you were mentioning, Mexico, you were mentioning Brazil. Well, in Chile, right, the protests, but and the new constitution that will be the vote coming up next month, I believe. I mean, I think what it all goes back to is what this all means for certainty of investment, certainty of contracts, right? So that there can be changes in the Chilean constitution. There can be a government on one side of the ideological spectrum in one country, another spectrum on the other country. But as long as that certainty is provided for current contracts as well as future contracts, and that helps to mitigate the political risk that exists. We have time, I think, for one more question there in the second row.
Loretta Green, I'm a senior fellow at the U.S. Nuclear Industry Council, and I was just going to ask you a question about, we talk about capital being available, and some of our government apparatuses are not letting nuclear into the game, and I think that that's the real elephant in the room for renewables. So maybe your observations on how the industry can see, how can we get better access to capital?
And we talked about nuclear. You talked about nuclear in the report, David.
Yeah, that's right. No, there's a lot of interest in advanced nuclear and new nuclear, both from Canada, I think on the south side, and then Brazil and Mexico and others. But I would turn to Ariel and to Christy on the capital. I don't know, is there a restriction on investment in nuclear for the IDB and for DFC?
For the IDB, yes, and that is part of our constituency. But let's face it, I mean, when we're talking about investing in the region, the IDB from the amount, is the most important stakeholder in Latin America, because we lend more than half of what is lent by the multilateral organizations in the region. But if you put that in total, that is not more than 3% of what is invested in Latin America and the Caribbean. Fortunately, because you have this private sector participation, you have an important role in the energy sector in Latin America, commercial banks are critical. So it is not something that is in our constituency, but I don't see that it will be a constraint for a commercial bank.
Christian, any constraints in your?
Sure. So within, there are various areas of the U.S. government that are very supportive of nuclear energy. I was in Brazil last month with the secretary. There were some letters of interest signed between private sector and Brazil. So clearly it's something that we're looking at. We're a new organization and we are evaluating a lot of our policies as the DFC, and nuclear is part of that.
With that, we don't always start on time, but I always like to end on time. Realize the people have the next meeting to go to. So with that, I want to again thank Department of Energy, our colleagues, for the incredible collaboration and putting this together. Kenny and Sheila there in the front row, and Undersecretary Menzies, who has left, but his opening remarks, as well as our excellent panel, my colleague Randy Bell, who we've partnered with over the course of the last 9 months on this project, who runs the Global Energy Center, Reed Blakemore, Deputy Director of the Global Energy Center, and Felipe Zamora in the Latin America Center, who've been working on this project. Please grab a copy of the report if you haven't on the way out, and look forward to now looking at how we actually turn some of these ideas into action. So thanks again very much for joining us today. Thank you.